Well, hello and welcome. I'm Guy Stevens with the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, and thank you for joining us for another Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint live event. I am actually in a different place today, which if you usually are watching the show, you probably know well that I usually have the Alliance banner over my shoulder, and today I'm in a different place. I actually happen to be traveling, and I'm in Virginia today, in Winchester, Virginia. So I am working a little bit differently today, not being in my usual space, but we are going to have a great show today. So I'm really excited to have you. For those of you that are not aware, the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint was an organization that I started about 3.5 years ago. The purpose of the organization is really raising awareness and helping to facilitate change around a lot of things that are being done to children, very often in the name of behavior, whether it's restraint or seclusion or suspension or expulsion or even corporal punishment. We're really trying to shift away from the punitive things that are being done to kids into better ways of supporting children and ultimately better ways of supporting teachers and staff as well. Ultimately, hopefully having an impact in ending the school to prison pipeline. These are things that we want to see change, and we do that both through legislative work as well as through education, like this event that you're joining us for today. So with that said, let me tell you what we're going to be doing today. As always, I get really excited about the guests that we have because we have some amazing people that I've had the opportunity to get to meet and work with and have a ton of respect for. And today is no to that. Today, I have Angelina Zara joining us for a special interview. And Angie is an educator, but so much more. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Angie here in a moment. I've had the privilege, I guess, of knowing Angie for a couple of years now, and we've collaborated on a couple of things. But I think you'll really enjoy today's discussion. It's really going to be kind of an interview format. And let's even get rid of that. It's really going to be a discussion format. We're going to have a talk, and you all are invited to join in and ask questions or share any thoughts that you might have. As always, I want to point out that the session today is being recorded. So you'll be able to go back and look at it on YouTube, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, or download it as an audio podcast. I do want to make you aware that you can put your questions and comments in the chat. So if you see the comment button over there, you can go ahead and put your comments that you might have. For now, though, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us who you are and where you're from. It's always great to see where we have people joining us from, and would love to hear about where you're joining us from today. So go ahead and tell us in the chat who you are and where you're from, and let me introduce you now to our very special guest. I'm really excited to have Angie here today. She, of course, is going to share a little bit about her journey from a teacher to a social emotional learning specialist. And Angie is somebody that for the best way to put it, has created positions that didn't even exist before in response to seeing needs in the schools that she's been working in. And that's sometimes what it takes, is it takes somebody to come in and change things and do things for the better. So Angie is a DC-based educator with a philosophy rooted in trauma responsive care, inclusion, and racial and social equity. Angie holds her master's in education from Trinity, Washington University, and completed her certification in the Applied Educational Neuroscience program at Butler University in 2020. And that is, I believe, how we met, was through the Applied Educational Neuroscience program. I had the privilege of speaking to a couple of the cohorts that have been through that program, and the privilege of meeting a number of amazing educators that have gone through that. Beginning in the 22-23 school year, which would be now, Angie has a new position and a new title as a social emotional learning specialist at her school. And this is a brand new role, and one that she really championed for school leaders to create. And, this work that she's been doing is really to have an impact to better support kids through consistent modeling, inter practice, advocacy, and shared research and trauma responsive care. She is a pioneer in the position of SEL specialist and a trailblazer as a trauma-informed leader, and someone that I am very lucky to know and have had a chance to work with. Angie, it's so great to have you here today, and I just want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Guy. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I just want to let people know that are already on the live stream to go ahead and tell us who you are and where you're joining us from. But I will mention already, Angie, that there are a couple of people, maybe even some like Dustin Springer from Kansas City. We know Dustin. Dustin was here with us last time. We have Bree, an advocate and parent from New Jersey. Friend here, Jennifer Abinet from Davis, California. We typically have people that are joining us from all around the world. It's not unusual that we have people from Australia, from New Zealand, from the UK. So as you're getting on, if you're from one of those places, help me show Angie that I'm not making this up. We really have people from all over the place. And I see my friend Mickey joining us from Austin. So Angie, thanks so much for making some time today. As I mentioned as we were doing your intro, I got to know you because you were involved in a applied educational neuroscience program at Butler University, taught by somebody that we're both a huge fan of, who told me, by the way, that she was traveling today, but she was excited about your presentation and was going to try to jump on. And that's Dr. Lori Desautel. For those that aren't familiar, Lori's actually, I think she's been our most frequent guest on our program. I think 5 or 6 times now we've had Lori or people that Lori's worked with. Lori is an educator and, of course, a pioneer really in applied educational neuroscience, teaches a complete program in applied educational neuroscience at Butler. And, one of the things I found through that program, aside from finding you, is that the people that are going through that program are all amazing. All the people that I've met that have gone through that, all are people that I think are pushing changes in education. So at any rate, with that said as an intro, I just want people to kind of understand this. Would you mind telling people, because you've got a lot of history and we'll get to all of that, but that applied educational neuroscience program, can you tell us a little bit about that and what appealed to you about that program and how maybe it transformed your approach as an educator?
Sure. So, as many people in this network that I've come to get to know, who I'd heard about previously, and then got to know in this trauma-informed network, may know that once you start to understand trauma-informed practices, especially in the context of education, something just clicks. And your eyes are open to just a brand new world of a different level of understanding, responsiveness, and frankly, like strategies that you can just add into your toolkit as an educator. So as I, immersed myself in the trauma network, I started seeking out higher education programs. I would say I found the Trauma Informed Network in 2016, which was my second year in the classroom, when I had huge behaviors that I did not have the tools to respond to yet and could not find other leaders or advocates to help me. So I just started digging into the research myself. And in 2019, through the Trauma Network, I was seeking master's programs to get maybe a master's in trauma-informed education, things like that. And the Twitterverse just kind of opened my eyes, and I somehow managed to, someone referred me to Dr. Lori, or I saw her tweet somewhere, and I just asked her about her program and the neuroscience program. I had known that neuroscience is tied to the trauma community. I think soon into my trauma informed immersion, I read Dr. Bruce Perry's book, and my life was changed even more. And so once I learned about the program, it just almost felt like the universe just kind of lines things up for you. And so once I started to learn about Dr. Lori's work, I learned about the program and I read the description. I thought, this is exactly what I'm looking for. Here's a built-in community. Here's a trailblazing leader in the trauma network who is facilitating these courses, who created this program. And so, it's almost like once your eyes continue to open, closing them is not an option. So that was kind of how I dug into the program. And then it just took off from there. Like you said, every single cohort member or speaker that I met in that program just became a part of my network and my community, my professional community. And it just
Mhm,
snowballed
mhm,
into
mhm,
a different level of
mhm,
momentum
mhm,
that I'm so grateful for. But ultimately, I don't think I would have been able to create the position that I've created at my school without, having the expertise that I gained from Dr. Lori's instruction,
mhm,
the
mhm.
program, and the network that I had to empower. When you're full of a network of innovative change makers, it helps the doubt subside.
That's
So
right. That's right. That's right. So let me go back in time a little bit more here. But before I do, I'm gonna share a few more things here. We have Shelley joining us from Iowa, former alternative trauma informed educator, and now an advocate and mentor. Love the connection of SEL and neuroscience, connecting with trauma informed. Kat asked a question, and this might be a little ahead of us, but I'll let you take a swing at it anyway. Does your classroom use a point and level system for all students? And of course, what I know is that you're no longer just I don't want to say just a classroom teacher. You're no longer really focused in the classroom. You're focused in a different role. But thinking about thinking about what I know about you, and thinking about the work that you would have done, and then people that you're working with now, how would you respond to incentives, point and level systems, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question that honestly has come up, with the teachers that I work with at my school. So I work with students from pre-K, so 3 through 10. So pre-K through 4th grade are the grade levels that my lower school encompasses. And when it comes to classroom-based incentive systems, my response is typically thinking about the goal that we're trying to achieve when it comes to student pro-social classroom behavior. And so what I think is really challenging sometimes when we think about how the school system was built, when we think about, what we perceive or have been conditioned to think as is conducive to learning, which is typically, very white Eurocentric compliance driven
Mhm.
behaviors.
Right.
When I think of using a point system to reinforce those behaviors, it feels counterproductive to what I think, what I know my goal is as an educator, and what I assume other teachers and educators' goal is, which is to co-facilitate the independence and autonomy to create helpful functional members of a thriving society, right? And so in order to do that, we need to empower students and set up students with like real what's the word I'm looking, real skills, right? So
Mhm,
like
mhm.
we don't need compliance driven skills. We don't need a student to listen and then hear a ding from class dojo to
Right,
know that
right,
like they are doing what they need to do in order to earn a specific response from their
right,
teacher or
right,
approval from their teacher.
right.
I do very much believe in like co-creating measurable goals as a community to create joy. So if we are thinking about reading stamina, and as a community, we're attempting to achieve 30 minutes of reading stamina through through reading habits, which would be your eyes are on your book, maybe you're whisper reading, maybe you're looking up while you're thinking, but so if we're exhibiting those specific behaviors, which are habits of readers, right, which is something that we would like
Mhm.
readers to do, and at the end of that goal, we get a great pizza party, and we get to each go to the book and pick out a library book that we're really interested in. Those incentives make much more sense because we're really thinking about specific goal setting and like habits of
Right,
learning as opposed to compliance driven behaviors. So
right, right, right. Yeah,
I
yeah. I'm,
yeah.
I'm with you 110%. I mean, we are very opposed to kind of the compliance-based approaches that are very prevalent. I mean, there's a lot of rewarding consequence-driven behavioral approaches that I would not only are ineffective for many kids, they can be harmful to a lot of kids as well, especially when we're talking about kids with a trauma history, kids with a disability,
Disabilities, yeah.
kids who these may not be working for. A couple more comments, and then I want to head to where I was headed here. Shelley also said I have a neuroscience background as well. Happy to see that. Happy to see more people getting more of a background in the neuroscience. I'm a firm believer, and I think, Angie, you probably would be too. I think a little bit of neuroscience goes a long way. If you
Oh yeah.
begin to understand a little bit about how the brain works, it totally changes the way you look at a kid and the way you look at behavior. And I think that's such an important shift for people. Jennifer said, you cannot look back once you become knowledgeable about trauma. I have Leonard Webb. Leonard actually speaks about trauma-informed care and the school to prison pipeline, and he is in Maryland. Say behaviors come from many places. It's up to those around the individual to understand what's beneath the surface. Yeah, and then which is so very, very true. So a lot of people jumping in here with a lot of comments, but let me take you back in time for a second. How did you get into teaching? Did you always know you wanted to be a teacher? What got you to being a teacher? Or if there's a who, tell us about that as well. How did you make that decision to take a road into education?
Yes, so it's actually a really interesting story that's definitely embodies a big part of my personal journey. I have personally experienced addiction. I am in recovery from alcohol. I'm almost 8 years sober. So I've experienced severe mental health issues, severe depression, anxiety, which manifested into really poor coping strategies through alcoholism. And basically, so I was living in the Midwest. I went to school in the Midwest, and I hit what's called like your emotional rock bottom in Chicago, where I was living. And I ended up coming home to Washington, D.C., where I live now, and entering an outpatient rehab for 8 weeks. And within week 4 of my outpatient, something, again, the universe just pulls us in certain different ways. I remember learning about neuroplasticity for the first time in rehab, the brain's ability to rewire. A part of my journey now, of course, is I always say I'm living proof of neuroplasticity given my sobriety. But something about being back in DC, it was almost like once I was able to be sober and the clouds, cleared, and I was able to kind of live within my true identity. Within 4 weeks, I realized that my only purpose was to be in education. By the end of my outpatient program, or within a year of my outpatient program, I was looking at master's programs for education, realizing that I want to teach kids in DC. It's just what I felt like seemed like the only clear possibility for me. I don't think that there's anything else that I'm meant to do. So I don't want to say I ended up being an educator, but just once the clouds cleared away, the universe just pointed me in the direction of my path that I was supposed to take.
It's interesting. There was a time that, I might have looked at that idea of the universe pointing us where it wants to a little more skeptically. But I can tell you that my life has changed, and I think the universe called me to be in a different direction. I spent 25 years in the environmental field, never planning to shift direction or to do something different. And of course, I had a personal experience with my son that led me to doing a lot of research and trying to understand what was happening in our schools and in our discipline systems, and how they were impacting children. So I'm very much a believer now that the universe has told me where I need to be, and here I am. And I'm glad the universe pointed you in that direction, because I know you are an amazing and a very inspirational educator, and you're doing some great things. And I think it's so important. So you mentioned specifically kind of like, I wanted to teach kids in DC. In the very early part of my career, actually, when I was actually a fisheries biologist, there you go, I worked in DC, and I occasionally visited schools throughout DC, presenting information about the environment in the bay and fish and all of that. And I always enjoyed going into the schools and working with kids. What about DC? What was it about DC that made you want to go there and support kids?
Yeah, well, it's my hometown. I'm born and raised in DC. I'm a public school DC graduate. And if you know about DC public schools, being a proud DC public school graduate, like we just have a lot of pride for like our city and our schools, even though, however the school system is how it is. I have a really good friend whose dad owns a very popular business in Washington, DC. And every year they would take kids from the neighborhood to the beach for like a kids beach trip. And I remember one year I went as a volunteer, and I remember, if you know about teaching city kids and taking them, to the beach, like I just remember I was like, that was wild. Like when I got home, I was like, I'm exhausted. That was crazy. But I would do that again. Like there's something about that where like the level of intensity just felt like appropriate. That was, I think, when I was in college. So there would still be several more years until I was able to kind of like, come to my full path. But
Mhm.
it just felt very natural. I feel like I understand DC kids. I am a DC kid. I feel like just my background in my parents and their social justice work and
Mhm.
just my mindset. I've always been a city girl, and why not teach city kids in my hometown? Uh-oh, guy might be frozen. So since guy, oh, there he is. Hey,
I apologize about that.
no problem.
Being in a different place. In fact, I'm glad we came back. I'm on a strange internet connection, which is not working the way it should. So I think I got a good part of your response, and then it disappeared. I apologize.
Yeah, no
Um,
problem.
so let's talk about, kind of when we get the, the why that led you there. And, when you first got into education, because I know that, you talked a minute ago about kind of the transformation that happened as you became kind of trauma informed and brain aligned and kind of moving. But let's talk about when you first started. What were some of the challenges, and what was it like when you began as a teacher? Did you feel like you were even appropriately equipped for the job that you were doing?
Yeah, so I mean, fortunately, the program that I came up through allowed us to have 1 year of, I guess it would be considered pre-service. So I had a mentor teacher who was able to kind of coach me along in my
Hmm.
first year. So my first year with a mentor teacher was really successful, and I learned a lot of things, and I really enjoyed it. The first year that I was on my own as my own teacher of record in my class, um, I taught third grade, and I quickly, again, like I said earlier, saw behaviors that I was not expecting to see. So, for example, I saw a lot of self harm in my third grade class. I saw suicide, or I heard and witnessed suicidal ideation, attempts at self harm, very, physical fighting, a lot of elopement. And I did not feel equipped. I did not feel equipped. And oftentimes I would ask administrators or colleagues, what are some strategies? What can I do? I don't know
Mm-hmm.
what to do. And I was met with, um, I didn't feel like the answers that I was met with, not to anyone, not to say anything negative about anyone, but I just don't think that people had the toolkit yet.
Right, right.
And so, I didn't feel like I was equipped. I did have a lot of supports, but I think sometimes depending on the background and the understanding and experience of the leadership that you have, they may not have the answers to, based on their experiences and classroom experiences, to equip teachers with what they may see in real time. I mean, the real answer is I teach in a Title I full inclusion school that serves all wards in Washington, D.C., which means that there certainly will be big behaviors and manifestations of disabilities that are, can, you know, put harm on adults and children, not because of ill intent, but because of just,
Hmm.
how
Hmm.
things manifest in behaviors. So, that's why I turned to the trauma community, because if I couldn't figure it out in my school network, then in my mind, it was either I stop teaching or I find another way. And luckily I found that way.
That's such a great point, because certainly these have been challenging times, right? These have been challenging times in education. The pandemic, many other things that have been going on have made for very challenging times. And we know that there are people that are, first year, second year teachers that are leaving the profession, a profession that they had really hoped to pour their lives into. Um, because they're not sure what to do. And you bring up that great point about, sometimes we're looking for answers from those that might have seniority or been there longer. But the problem is that schools, like anything else, are sometimes places where we keep doing the same things even though they're not working.
Mhm.
And many times those things are based around compliance and control. It's around, how do we control situations? How do we get the kids to comply? But you kind of looked at the options and what you and said this doesn't. There's got to be something else, right? So that started your journey into what else is there and what can I do differently. So what advice would you have for a teacher, young teacher, gets into the right reasons, wants to help kids, is in a really punitive culture or punitive school, but knows there must be a better way? What do they do? How do they make that journey? Because I'm sure you have tough days, but I also know from our conversations that you love doing what you're doing and that you continue to have more and more um, ideas and influence in how to make things better. So what would your advice be for somebody that's, kind of starting off and struggling?
I think the power of community is so important. And I think that in a school building or in a field, there has to be at least one person that can offer support or strategies to help build that toolbox for a new teacher. Um, so, always my advice and my advice to my staff that I work with is ask for what you need, ask for support. Because if we do not ask for what we need and we don't ask for help, then we are not in a place to grow and
Mhm,
and
mhm.
pivot and respond accordingly. Something else that I recommend, like if I were to be speaking to a new teacher who's watching this, who, may have anxiety about responding to a tier 3 behavioral crisis where maybe there's
Right.
physicality with the student. I also think that making a response plan to center your own wellness is something that is really important,
Mm,
because
mm, mhm.
at the end of the day, like, we have to stay regulated when we respond to these behaviors, because otherwise our stress response system will be activated. It will have negative impacts on our brain and body state, and ultimately we will not be able to serve our students. So something that I offer my teachers when I notice that they may be grappling with how to respond to a crisis is, well, first of all, because of the nature of my position and the fact that it's very new and I can kind of create it as I go, I would literally sit beside and co-regulate a teacher in a crisis
Right,
to
right,
model how
right.
to remain calm and how to respond appropriately and depersonalize the behavior. Or if that's not feasible, like, let's make a crisis response plan for yourself. What are
Right.
some strategies that you're going to do? What deep breathing are you going to tap into? Who's a colleague that you can ask to come in to support you in your classroom because you need to just take 5 minutes to do the strategies that we tell our students to do? Splash some water on your face, do some positive self-talk, like, schedule your mental health day, and then, like, let's get back in there and build that resilience. So I would say, yeah,
Yeah,
seek the
I love
support.
that. Right,
Yeah.
right, right. I love that. So, you had your personal journey. You decided you wanted to teach. You get into teaching. You realize some of the gaps there, some of the challenges there. You begin to look for what fills those gaps. You begin to look for community. You get into the trauma informed space. Um, what's the key to the transformation there? So at some point, there's this something clicks, right? At some point, you find that thing that maybe was missing or that understanding that was missing. What was it for you? I mean, what was it that began to make that really click, and your realization that, oh, there's a different way, there's a better way? Is there anything specific that you can recall that kind of helped you along that road?
I mean, ultimately, my guiding core values in this field is like my belief in a child's capacity to do well if they can.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I'm responsive to data and research. I think, as like you said with the neuroscience, as we start to look into brain states and we start to just take a small chunk of the research and implement strategies, and then you start to see that they're effective, right? They work. That's when you start to have like the hope, and you're like, wait, so if I continue to implement these strategies on a regular basis, like with myself and with children, like, what might happen, right? So if you truly believe that kids can do well and that inherently children want to do well, they're
Yeah.
wired to want to do well, they're inherently good beings, then then,
That's an important piece, right?
yeah.
Very often people look at kids and they think they're manipulative, they're limit testing, they're challenging, they're all of these things. But they don't realize that these are human beings that have been through sometimes trauma, sometimes stress, sometimes have, a manifestation of a disability. It's important to remember, kids don't have fully developed brains, especially very young kids. They don't have the skills they need to self-regulate. So that philosophical change is really important one. That acknowledgement that a kid would do well if a kid could do well is a really important thing to do. So I mean, I can see how that is transformative. I know in my own journey, kind of some of the transformation with that as well. So you get back, you begin to get some of this knowledge. You begin to go through the Applied Educational Neuroscience program. You're still in the classroom at that point. What happens? What are the changes that you see? So from the knowledge that you're getting, because knowledge is one thing, but application is another, right? So we can learn something. We can, I know this, but to be able to take it and to apply it and to make improvements that are helping the kids that you're serving, that are helping yourself. What did that look like? What did it look like as you began to apply knowledge that you were learning into your classroom as you were still a teacher at that point?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of trial and error, a lot of, it's the same kind of concept where you're maybe learning a really great new math strategy and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited to try this. And then you try it and it's not perfect, but there's a little bit of progress and maybe one kid has a positive outcome, right? And it really clicks. And so just, the willingness again to keep trying. I think something else that I received that was really helpful was, I did have, again, like having a community where you can try and then reflect and then try again, I think is really important. I think being willing to be like observed is also something that can be really important with these strategies. I'm sorry, I just had a total brain fart. Would you mind asking the second part of the question again?
Oh gosh, now you're really going to.
Sometimes I just get lost in the sauce.
So what I was really trying to figure out is, after going out and finding your community and how you brought that to the classroom, how you brought about changes because of what you were beginning to learn and your kind of philosophical change. So what that looked like. I mean, yeah. So how did that manifest in terms of working with the kids on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's really just taking the practices that, like, if I'm learning about focus attention practices and, mindfulness, and I'm literally getting a tool from my program that says, here's a focus attention practice that I've done with children that we're modeling in class as a community of learners. I would take that focus attention practice, and the next morning I would say, okay, guys, this is something that I've learned. Again, that modeling piece of like, I'm a learner. And so I want to try this with you. And maybe this won't be helpful for you, but maybe it will be helpful for one person in here. And if it helps one person, and I know that it helps me, then like that's a win. And then maybe tomorrow we'll try a new strategy. Right. And then it's really just about like, that I just was able, when you model the practices that you want learners to see, it's the same transfer of knowledge in a way. Like in literacy and in math, only you're modeling regulation, you're modeling risk-taking, you're modeling coping strategies. So it's just aligns with the principles of education, right? If we have our community of learners and we are modeling and teaching these practices, these strategies, why would they not catch on in the same ways we expect this entire school system to run, where we expect math strategies and literacy strategies to take with students' brains. So it's just applying the same principles, but just in a, very specialized way that helps construct, again, those like helpful functioning, members of society. So it's just, the ability to take risks, model vulnerability and transparency, and be willing to fail.
No, I love that. Again, a willingness to fail means that you try things, and not everything may not work for every student, right? But when you are able to connect with a student, and I think the principles and the philosophy that you brought in kind of after really, finding the approaches that aligned with you those are so critical, right? I want to get to in a second. I want to get to kind of what happened next. But before I do, there's been a lot of chatter, and I don't want to miss it all. So I'm going to go through a couple of these comments and questions real quick. Karen Burrs, who is an amazing special educator in Oregon, said, I jumped on late looking for the higher education. What program is this? And Karen, I believe what we were talking about at the time that you might have caught us was the Applied Educational Neuroscience program by Dr. Lori Desautel at Butler University. And I've just put that in the chat as well, so you'll be able to see that. That's a program that not only has Angie been through, but our guest last week, Dr. Dustin Springer, had been through as well. And several of the people that we've interviewed have done this as well. Shelley says, thank you for speaking on this topic. Let's see what else we have here. Let's see. All right. So Kat had just said, unfortunately for emotionally disturbed children, are exposed to compliance-based point and level systems throughout the country. And that's true. A lot of these approaches that really, I would say not only aren't evidence-based, but are causing difficulty for a lot of kids, Kat. So there's a lot of change that needs to happen. Leonard says that I spent 27 years in law enforcement, and the universe called me as education as well. And I've talked to Leonard before, and I know that to be true. And, again, I used to not be the person that would say the universe is calling us, but I feel like there's a number of people. Angie, I think about a number of people that we know together. Maybe there's a big movement here, the people that are being called. A lot of people in our audience as well. And speaking of which, Jennifer Abinat, curious parents get things moving. Yep, absolutely. Oh, look at this. How about Jody?
Hey, Jody.
Jody from Virginia joining us as well. Oh, we had a lot of comments here, so I'm just going to get through a few more here.
I think he'll be back soon, guys. If I know Guy, his stress response system is activated right now with being frozen. All right, so it's just me. So I can definitely respond to some of these discussions around punitive and exclusionary discipline. I think, hey, Dustin, I think it's really interesting to think about. To me, there's always a direct correlation with teacher regulation and punitive exclusionary discipline. So I always wonder why we're sending students out of the room, why we're sending a student to someone who is not us. Something that I always told my students when I was a teacher is that there's nowhere that I'm going to send you because, first of all, we have all the strategies we need to calm down and regulate in our classroom. 2, we have a space to calm down in our classroom and a space to take space if we need it. And 3, I'm the closest proximity to like a caregiver than my principal.
Okay, I had a bit of a technical issue here, and I don't know if I'm back or not. Angie, can you hear me?
You're back. Yeah, I was
I'm
responding to the discussion around like exclusionary discipline. So I just kind of started taking over, but I'm so glad you're back.
Awesome. Well, I've never had quite this kind of problem before. Right now I'm connected through my cell phone. So hopefully the cell phone will keep us connected, and we'll just try it at that. But thank you for jumping and continuing on. I was trying to look at the comments here. We got a lot of great comments. People talking about Sandy Lerman mentioned community care. Jody said, let's see, I'm in a new school this year and seeing so many falling back to exclusionary discipline. That's probably what you were addressing there as a reaction to behavior. And those exclusionary practices, of course, are really harmful. And when we think about a lot of the things that happen to kids, and I would say don't do kids, restraint, seclusion, suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, all of these things are further traumatizing kids that typically have trauma histories. And from my experience, they lead to more, not less behavior. So very often these approaches that people fall back to are not only not helping, they're making things worse. But why do you think that is? I mean, why do you think that, when times are tough, that people fall back to things even if they're not working?
Well, I was sharing that I think there's always a wondering around why students are being excluded. My main push when I started this position and, fortunately have the alignment of my leadership team and my boss, my principal, is that we need to maximize time in classrooms. We need to equip teachers with tools to respond to behavior. And we need to make sure that we are maximizing time in the room. There's nowhere that's going to be helpful for a student to re-engage with learning outside of their room. I also think sometimes when we're talking about students with disabilities, we have to look within. We have to think about, are we differentiating the work, the academic demands appropriately to meet student need? Because chances are, if a student isn't able to engage from an empowered place, then they're going to do something that is more preferred, which is not be in their learning community. So what role do we have to make
Mm-hmm.
sure that we are engaging students in a way that helps them feel, included from the real inclusion lens? And then I was also just saying, as our stress response level, increases, we resort to ineffective outcomes and ineffective practices because we don't know what else to do. And so I ultimately think it becomes a
Right.
teacher capacity issue.
Yeah, I often say that, and I think because we've had a lot of conversations. I'm very empathetic towards teachers, staff, towards how do we better support educators, and others in the classroom. And I think the challenge is if you can't imagine another solution, you can't imagine another solution, right? So if you've not been exposed to better alternatives, it's all that you know. And that's where programs like this Applied Educational Neuroscience program comes into play. That's where building that community comes into play. There's so many things that we can do to help support people, but sometimes it means shifting away from the things that aren't working, right?
Yeah, I also think the people on this call are obviously people, if you're working in schools like Jody, I know, you're a disruptor, right? So if there are students that are systematically excluded, and probably the intersectionality of race and disability is
Mm-hmm.
something that should be considered here, right? Which then
Absolutely.
becomes an equity issue. So we have to reflect on, as educational leaders, what role are we playing in actively disrupting and dismantling those inequities? And that might look like having a courageous conversation with a colleague. Hey, I noticed that is outside of the classroom a lot. Do you need some help figuring out strategies to support them? Or just engaging in those conversations so that we're not,
Mm-hmm.
being bystanders.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it looks like you did a really good job when I disappeared on you. And a couple of people made comments here. Jennifer said, you have this. And Shelley said, Angie, that was a really good response to the situation. So thank you for your flexibility. I apologize about the technical issues here. I do have one more, or maybe two more questions here that are popping up from people. But then I want to get on with the rest of your story. I want to talk about how you shifted and why you shifted your focus from a classroom teacher into SEL. So from Jennifer, how do you handle situations where the teacher/staff say, we have to remove the student because they are disrupting the entire class? This is often their reason, which in my opinion is unacceptable, because we know there are ways to ensure that things don't arise to that level.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple ways to go. I think teacher reflection is necessary, right? So why is when I hear about a behavior, my first question is, well, why? Why is a student disrupting class? What are they
Right.
trying to communicate in their disruption? Are they trying to communicate, I don't want to do this because it's too hard. I don't want to be in here because I don't feel welcome. What is the underlying communication?
Or I
Because
can't, right? Or I can't do it, right?
or I can't. And then again,
Right.
the responsibility falls on the teacher to provide the scaffolds and reframe, right? That's another social emotional learning strategy of the reframing of the thinking of instead of saying I can't, let's say instead, I need some help, but I'll try to get started.
Right.
Right. So it's like interrogating that idea of like, well, why? Why is this student disrupting the class repeatedly? And then also holding teachers accountable with their tier one proactive strategies in community building. A really great quote from Dr. Laurie, or like a reflection question that I heard from the neuroscience class is, what is the, like, thinking about the classroom climate, when you enter a room, is it in a state of regulation or dysregulation? And then how is that conducive to learning or not? Especially when we think of our more neurodiverse or, not neurotypical students. So, just kind of asking the why, and
That's
always
right.
using data, I think, is something that's really important. And also starting with yourself, right? Because like
Yeah.
before you're checking in with others and asking why 6 Black boys are in the hallway doing small group work every day during literacy, you might want to look within first and say, what do my equity practices look like? What does my discipline practice look like? Am I in a place to model leadership? Am I walking the walk? And if I am, then I think you should be empowered to try again to dismantle those mindsets.
So I had a long comment here from our friend Floyd. Floyd said, often when I've heard of or observed the idea of modeling, I usually have observed it as a tool of coercion. We do that. We do what we want to see in the world, and then celebrate those that do the right way and discipline the folks that don't. I've started to shift my thoughts around this topic from modeling to embodying my values and supporting others and embodying their own values. I don't want to be in a space where people do what I can do, but rather what they can do. That's a great point from Floyd. And Floyd is always very, very thoughtful about things. That's an interesting, take on that.
I agree. And Floyd, I feel like that makes so much sense, because we also have to think about culture
Right.
and how culture and lived student identity and experience impacts how students show up in their classroom. And that my culture and my skin I'm in and my lived experience is not the same like as any of my students. And therefore, how they're going to show up is going to be completely different, not because it's wrong, but because it's a different embodiment of the skin that they're in, and they're, what's led them
hmm
to that
hmm
moment. And so
hmm
that's
hmm
why I think we also have to reflect on, like, when we're seeking like regulation in a student or co-regulation, it has to have that like culturally responsive component of like, me
Great
in a
point.
regulated state is going to look different than Floyd's regulation. So I think that's just like really important. And really, again, like that equity component of like every learner is different, and every learner is not, for me, like a white presenting biracial woman from Washington, D.C. with, all these other intersectionalities.
So I think what you said, Floyd said, yes, yes, yes. So I think that really resonated with him. Leonard had a comment here. What are your thoughts or response to a teacher who says, a child is playing you, a child is manipulating you? And we hear that a lot, right? We often make the worst intent assumptions about children rather than giving them the benefit of the doubt, and often go to, it's intentional, right? And people think often that all behavior is intentional. And we know now that it's not. We know there's a lot of different things that might drive a behavior. So what are your thoughts on that? If you had a educator that came to you in your role and said, hey, this kid's just playing me.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have seen and said that people are being played out by children. And what I mean by being played out by a kid is that there is intentional pushing of boundaries, and not adhering to boundaries, typically because the educator is not withholding those boundaries and expectations with consistency. And
Mm-hmm.
therefore, the educator is getting played by the kids. And typically it occurs in like a group dynamic. That's my experience, right? So I think, again, it falls back on the educator to reflect on, like, if I'm getting played out by 80% of my class, then what are the moves that I'm making, and what consistency am I missing? What accountability measures or high expectations am I not maintaining that's helping perpetuate that? When it comes to something like manipulation, that again makes me ponder, like, what is manipulation?
Right,
What
right.
is the manipulative behavior that you're referring to? And if you're referring to something as savvy as manipulation, then really, if we, again, think about our belief about children, if a child is exhibiting a very, very savvy, like maladaptive coping strategy of manipulation, it's likely a learned behavior, right? And then again, the onus does not fall on the child who has learned the maladaptive behavior, but the onus falls on the adult to proactively or responsively teach the necessary skills to replace what am I seeking when I'm trying to manipulate? Am I trying to get my way? Well, what are some better ways that I can communicate trying to get my way, and equipping the kids with that repetition. So again, it's like, those, when we're really thinking about that language, like what explicitly are we referring to? Because sometimes we make blanket statements about children that aren't objective.
Right. So we've had a lot of great comments, and I want to get away from them for a second, though, and kind of go on a little bit more in your story. But it's great to see all this interaction. I think people are really excited about what you have to share. So you're a classroom teacher. You're doing things that you've learned through your trauma-informed journey, through your neuroscience, and then you begin to see another need. Talk to me about how you went from a classroom teacher to your current role, and what drove that, and what you're hoping to see come out of that.
So it wasn't that I saw another need. It was that I knew the needs that I saw in my classroom were happening in every classroom. So what typically, kind of how my career trajectory went was like, I became the teacher where I'm like, give me the hardest kids, and like I will build the most positive relationship with them. Like we will be engaged in extracurriculars by the end of the year. Our academic achievement will increase. Like you're going to feel a sense of belonging. Like let's go. Like let's really do it, because these practices were so effective, right? And so what I just began to really like gain my confidence, and I began to see like the data, right? Increased academic achievement. I had a student, one of my favorite students of all time, in the beginning of third grade. He was out of the classroom, eloping and avoiding 80% of his day, 80% of the day, with chronic attendance issues, would punch holes in the wall. By the end of the school year, or even by midway in the school year, in the classroom 100% of the time, again, attending multiple extracurricular activities, classroom leader, leading classroom and regulation strategies. So I just began to see not only that this could work in my classroom, but that if all teachers had these strategies and this mindset, that we could maybe start to change our education system, right? Like we could maybe make a big dent, because not only would I have students with increased time in the classroom that really changed their school trajectory, but like also students who were in child study for disabilities because they might have experienced acute trauma, but because they had a very strong relationship with their teacher, a strong family partnership, they were out of the special education trajectory and their academic achievement increased, right? So it doesn't just affect like the behavioral outcomes of children, but it affects like their academic outcomes and their school experience. And if we can change the trajectory of a kid's school experience, you talked about the school to prison pipeline, like what if you can make an impact where like you can make that change? Right? Like how great could we, the great work that we could do, right? So that's where I was just like, here's my data, here's my experience, like let's go. Let's get this for everybody. Let's get to work.
Right. So I got to jump in on that real quick. You make the change. It reminds me of a comment that my friend Susan Hopkins, who works with Stuart Schenker with Self-Reg in the Merit Center, we often find that teachers and others are looking for tools and strategies. But Susan had this great quote where she said, "You are the strategy. It's you're the strategy." And how you launched into that was talking about what's near and dear to my heart, which is relationships. I'm not the only one that says it, but when I think about the 3 R's of education, it's relationship. Relationship is what can support a kid who has had complex trauma, generational trauma, who has a disability and has not been understood. Those relationships can be the difference between success and a child that ends up on the wrong path. So I love your emphasis on that. And, you sometimes hear like, well, we don't have time for relationships. We don't have time to build relationships with 25 kids. And the truth is that there's a lot of kids that don't have the same needs. I mean, maybe it's 3 or 4 kids that really need that extra work and that extra relationship. I mean, all kids are going to benefit, right? But I think it's so important, even if it feels overwhelming, to make that investment. So what brought you to that? I mean, or was that just always who you were? Was trying to build the relationships?
Well, I was always very relationship driven with children. I mean, I think at this point, when it comes to education, given where our educational system is, if educators are not willing to build authentic relationships with children and with the students,
Authentic, such an important
yeah,
word, right?
yeah,
When I hear things like therapeutic relationship, kids are the biggest, excuse my language, bullshit detectors in the
oh
world.
yeah,
If you're faking a relationship, you might as well not even make the effort. It
right.
takes an authentic relationship.
Exactly. And if you don't have the capacity or the willingness or the desire to build authentic relationships with the humans that you're teaching at this
Right,
point in education, you should not be in education. I
right,
really
right.
think that. I really think that like where we are post pandemic, given where society is and what we know a lot of our kids are coming in with, we just it's just not a choice. Teaching is not you show up, you teach all day and you go home. It's a lot more than that. So I was always relationship driven. That always was one of my core, drives. But I again, it's like the research. I think Bruce Perry's
Yep.
work, like everything, that started to come out of the pages was like relationships,
Yeah.
repetition, and I'm just like,
Right, right,
okay,
right.
this
The great.
reaffirms
What's the quote? The greatest therapy is human love and
beauty.
connection. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. So Shelley, I've said this many times as well. You don't have time not to build relationships with students. Of course, our friend Dustin. Dustin, great to have you here. Relationships are foundation of what we do and who we are, and that's where we build safety. And of course, safety is foundational. If a kid doesn't feel safe, a kid can't learn.
Cannot
And yes,
access the learning part of their brain.
yeah,
Hi,
and look who we have. We have Dr. Lori here.
Dr.
We've been talking a lot about you, Dr. Lori, and we'll have to talk about your upcoming book here as well. But great to have you here. Let's continue on this for a second. So you saw the need in your classroom, and then you knew that others were having that need. How did this turn into a new position, and what are you doing in your current position?
So basically, I campaigned for my principal, who is amazing. Saw was really bought into my work. I also on the side, it wasn't just like I was in my classroom, I was, walking the walk. I was also writing and creating things. I was creating summer projects to model the power of community, how to build community in a pandemic. I was doing all of these side projects. I created like a wellness team centered in like adult regulation. I just kept creating these committees, creating these documents, quoting all this research. And I just was like that person because it works. And I
Right.
was leading PDs. And so I was already becoming, the trauma person at my school, the classroom management person, the SEL person. And I just, kept reiterating, like, just give me a chance. Like, give me a chance to do this on a big picture scale. And I promise you, like, I can start to make a real impact. Let me, zoom out. And, not only did I have the student data, the relationships, with students and walking that walk, but also like, really applying my leadership through sharing research, professional development, and things like that. And it took a lot, but the position was created. And then, yeah, my day to day is pretty crazy.
I'm going to make some guesses here, but I mean, I think so. Let me reframe this a little bit. I know and have met amazing educators that are doing fantastic work in their schools that have been very successful in reducing restraint seclusion, moving away from punitive practices, that have been really provided some leadership in the schools that they've been in. And their stories are not always the same. It's not always appreciated. And I hate to say that, but
Yeah.
we find cases where teachers are trying to, and I think about a teacher that I mentioned earlier, teachers are trying to bring about positive change and the system pushes against them. Now, when I think about your success, and I'm just looking from an outsider that knows a bit about you. I think that your success could be attributed in part to persistence.
Hmm.
When I think about you, Angie, you are not going away. You are going to be persistent. But
Hmm.
you're also, I think, a really, I hate to say the word salesperson, but I think that you're good at selling your ideas, and selling your ideas is important. If you can't sell your ideas to others, it's hard to get people to move in the right direction. But thinking about that first problem, I mean, I even know educators that have done amazing work that have had been retaliated against because they're
Hmm.
pushing against a system that doesn't want to change. What is
Yeah.
your advice for somebody? I mean, it wasn't just that you were, I mean, maybe you had a better administrator and you had a team there that was more receptive, and that can make a difference.
Hmm.
But
It does.
but
Yeah.
certainly your persistence and the things that you did got you there. What advice might you have for an educator that's running against that? It's running against, trying to make change but not being supported.
Yeah, I mean, again, like I think just like we tell our learners, like the power of community is really helpful to build that resilience. And
Right.
I mean, I also heard no a lot. I heard no a lot. And I was rejected for
Right.
this position. The proposal was rejected. I experienced a lot of rejection. And it did not deter me because I know that in order to be like a change maker, you're going to hear no. But if you believe in, your purpose and the truly, it's not even about me, but it's about, I believe so much in the work that it doesn't matter how many times you hear no, you just have to keep going. But I do think, when it comes to alignment, um, and thinking about sustainability for self, it really is important to find some allies
Hmm.
somewhere, either in the school system, colleagues at your school, because chances are with this research, I mean, unless you're in a very, I just can't imagine that there would be not one person in a school building that would be able to catch on and buy into this stuff.
Right.
If
Right. Right.
you, and so I think like not working in a silo and continuing to move the work forward, model, model, model. And I think one of the reasons that I've been so effective in my role now is because I was a teacher
Hmm.
in the school that I'm working
Okay.
in. So
Right.
teachers know that I've really walked the walk, and walking the walk of a teacher with getting some of the hardest kids in the school
Right.
gets a lot of buy-in. And when you add that with the research,
Absolutely.
people can't say that doesn't work because you're living walking proof that it works.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a great point about finding allies, right? And even though you might feel alone, if you can win over one and win over another, I think about all the times I've given away copies of books to people. I can imagine, passing somebody, connections over compliance or whatever it may be, and getting a conversation started, or maybe having a book club, at the school and getting people to talk about some of these concepts. But change is hard, and sometimes systems are resistant to that change. And I told you earlier that we have people from all over the world. And Linda, thank you. Linda is I can count on Linda to tune in from New Zealand, where I'm going to get it wrong, Linda. I know it's probably 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning there tomorrow. So it's already Friday morning there. But we really do have a great, in fact, Linda did some work with, Bruce Perry as well. So we've got
Oh,
this great
wow.
community that goes beyond the United States and kind of an international community. Dustin, of course, talked about persistence and being a louder voice is what's going to change these systems and no longer serving our communities. And sometimes it's not even louder, but it's being able to change the thoughts and ideas of the right people, right? So sometimes you can do that through persuasion, but I think persistence is so key. And of course, Lori says yes, and Dustin gave you a 100% yes as well. So now that you're doing this work, are you finding, are there other schools that have similar roles to this, or have you written anything that talks about kind of the roadmap to what you were doing and why you were doing it? Because it sounds like this has been really beneficial to your school. So how do we get others kind of moving in that direction as well?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a really good question, and one that I haven't had the chance to dig into too much yet. I mean, I think a roadmap would be helpful.
You see where I'm headed with this, right? You see where I'm headed. I mean, I can
Yeah, I
imagine
do.
an article that you write. I can imagine a presentation about this. But really, I mean, when we talk about, we sometimes talk about being disruptors and disrupting the system.
Yeah.
We need to take stories like yours and get them out there to people about the kind of change. And I mean, I think it's a great thing to think about, moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely something to think about. To answer the first question, I don't think that there are roles like my role, to my knowledge, in at least in DC. There's still a lot of, and this is where, like, old, I don't know that I can't, I'm trying to think of some kind of, lovely little phrase, but it's like, old habits die hard, maybe.
Right,
So it's
right,
typically when I was, because I did tell my school, I was like, look, I either want this position here or I'm going to go somewhere else and try to find
right,
what I'm looking for. So when I was looking,
right.
there's still a lot of dean, coordinator of school culture, I think is one, or like culture coordinator, behavior technician, behavior specialist. And none of those encompass, in my opinion, like what the work that I feel like I'm doing with social emotional learning specialists, the opportunity to coach teachers, work with administrators, do big picture strategic planning, and work with students, pushing in with students, pulling small groups with students, working one-on-one with students. Like, we're really talking about getting in there and being proactive and responsive, but it sounds like a lot of those things are still rooted in the reaction lane. Oh, that's a cool question, Shelley. Inventing the federal Department of Ed people. I don't know what that would look like. I run around all day. They'd have to just wear sneakers and follow me around. Let's see if Guy heads back soon. Oh, Jennifer, thank you for sharing. And Jennifer, I actually wanted to answer one of your questions. You asked about, oh, hey, Guy. Sorry, I was going to answer one of Jennifer's other
Oh,
questions.
no, please do. Yep. I could hear you, but you couldn't hear me, but go ahead.
Oh, okay, perfect. So Jennifer, yeah, I
Yep.
mean, first of all, thank you for sharing that. I'm so sorry for your loss. Um, I did want to just respond to a question that you had about creating culture with students. And it's interesting that you say that, because if anyone is coming to the Creating Trauma Sensitive Schools conference, I am literally presenting on that topic, how to co-create a community, an equity-driven, trauma-informed community. And there are definitely practices that, like, when I create my classroom community, we do everything together. I mean, we don't set up the classroom together because they have to come into a setup classroom, but like we co-create our norms. Everyone signs them, including me. We co-create our regulation strategies. We co-create, our expectations. We co-create, just everything is like collaborative. So to answer your question, if we're not talking about like compliance and like, you should do this, it's like, what do we expect to have? How can we thrive in a community together and work together to create expectations that we can all agree to, including the adults? Something I always tell kids is like, every expectation I ask you to do, I will do. So like, there's nothing in here that like I'm not going to also uphold.
So thank you for that. And I just wanted to go back to what we were talking about earlier. And I just shared the link to the Attachment Trauma Network conference. And of course, not only will you be there, I'll be there, Jody will be there, Dustin will
Yes.
be there. We've got an amazing group of people that are going to be at that event. So if you're an educator, a paraprofessional, administrator, whatever it may be, look up the Attachment Trauma Network conference. Parents, I mean, anyone that's interested in coming. It's a really great event that's out there. But I'm just thinking, I'd love to see maybe a future presentation from you on this idea of like creating the change that you're, trying to see creating the kind of position that you created there, with your school. So maybe a future conference, I'll hear you talking about that, because I think
Love that idea.
yeah. I think there's a big need for it. Well, listen, we are getting right about time, and given the technical issues that we've had, I want to one, thank you for being part of this conversation. It's been a privilege to know you and get to collaborate with you on things, and the work that you're doing is, I know it's fulfilling because you're making differences for kids. You're doing things that, there are kids that you're going to be seeing in 10 years from now that, you've made a difference in their life. And the work that you're doing is really meaningful. So thank you for all you do. Thank you for spending time with us today. I want to give you an opportunity, if there's any kind of final words you want to leave us with, or any last wisdom that you'd like to share with us. Let me give you the final word here.
I just want to again walk the walk and say that something that I haven't been doing as much is leaning into my trauma network and community. So I just am asking my trauma peeps out there, let's stay connected. I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you guys at the trauma conference. And I just really appreciate the engagement. And Guy, you are such a hardworking, amazing soul. So I really appreciate the chance to work with you and just talk about this work. I get so fired up. So, thank you. And thanks everyone for engaging.
Absolutely. And we had a great group today. And I really appreciate everybody being so engaged. When we do these live events, it's really exciting to see so many people weighing in and asking questions and providing comments. And a lot of great thank yous here as well. In fact, we're getting them moving through here. So thank you so much for being here today. Normally I would shift my screen and show who's coming up next week, but given the technical issues I'm having, I'm just going to say be here again in 2 weeks. We have another great speaker lined up, and unfortunately, because Facebook is blocked right now, I don't have that in front of me. But I'm glad we got through this. Angie, thank you for your flexibility when the system kind of broke on us here. That's never happened before, but if it was going to happen, I was glad it was you, because you seem to just kind of roll with it. So thank you for that.
No problem.
And I look forward to continuing to work with you and connect with you, and continue working shoulder to shoulder with you and so many people that are making positive change in the world. It's going to make a difference. So Thank you much. We'll see you again.
See you in Houston.
See you in Houston in person. It's funny, because we're not that far away from each other, and
I know.
Not met you in person, but I'll meet you in person in Houston. But thanks so much, and goodbye, everybody. Take care.
Bye, guys.